so nice to see everyone. We're all working from various locations, but some of you are familiar faces and some new faces. So it's wonderful that you are joining us today for what we hope is a really exciting session. Dr. Jane Thomas is Assistant Director at the Leadership Institute, and we're really proud. This is her first year with us, and boy, she has really helped us develop further programming. We do customized training for companies, and we are working on an executive level training. So lots of really great things ahead. And so thank you, Jane. Just to tell you a little bit about Jane's background, she's a professor, a researcher, and a consultant. And her focus is on workplace relationships, teams, and emotions in the workplace. So at our last session in both the Explorer Academy and Leadership Northwest Indiana program, we talked about emotional labor and emotions and stress at work. And all of us learned a lot during that conversation. Jane's research has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, and she's been published in a lot of premier academic journals. She has experience not just in academia, but she also worked in private industry in recruiting and employee relations for 2 privately owned firms. And she's had consulting engagements all across the United States. She now is an instructor at the university doing undergraduate and graduate level business programs. She applies her practical knowledge and her industry expertise to student learning in the classroom. She holds a Ph.D. in organizational science from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte and a bachelor's in psychology with highest distinction from Pennsylvania State University. Besides that, she's a mother of 2-year-old twins. She is a active and lively member of the PNW community and a friend to so many of us. So Jane, welcome, and teach us how to make meetings amazing. We're dying to hear.
Thank you so much, Sheila and Rachel. I will try my best. I'm not a miracle worker. I can just share with you what we know from meetings research, and hopefully all of us can gain some tips and tricks regarding how to improve our meetings. Let me share my screen really quickly. I do have some slides. I am a college professor, so I must have a slideshow. It is part of who I am. So I'm focusing on why workplace meetings stink, and most importantly, learning how to lead a better meeting. So I'm sure we all have some ideas as to what makes many workplace meetings so horrible, but what do we know from research on meetings? What can we do to make them a little bit better? So that's hopefully where everyone's going to get some insights today. But first, let's talk about some meeting stats. As Sheila mentioned, it is estimated that there are 55 million meetings per day in the United States. And looking at some historical data, about 40 years ago, in the late 1970s, it was estimated that there were 11 million meetings per day. So over the past 40 years, we can pretty safely say that meetings have grown. There's a lot of reasons why this is happening. A lot of good reasons. Many organizations are more team-based. They're actively soliciting opinions from more people, which is good, but that means more meetings. We also estimate that from different surveys of working employees across the United States, there are several instances when too many meetings have been cited as the #1 time waster. So this was a specific study done by salary.com of over 3,000 workers in the United States. It's estimated that the annual cost of meetings in the United States is about $1.4 trillion. How do you come up with a figure like that? That seems astronomical. Well, you look at everyone's salary, hourly rate, and you look at how much time they spend in meetings. So just looking at the time from a salary and wage perspective, it's estimated that meetings cost businesses in the US about $1.4 trillion. When we look at how many bad meetings people attend, we know not all meetings are bad, but a hefty portion of them are not the best. Just looking at those bad meetings, it's estimated, again, using this wage approach, seeing how much people make and how much time their salary and wages are being spent in these meetings, It's about $250 billion just on these bad meetings. And that doesn't even take into account the hidden costs of bad meetings. That's just looking at people's salary and hourly wage. We're not looking at the hidden costs of, let's say, opportunity costs. You have those employees in those meetings, they're held hostage by these horrible this time spent on Zoom calls or locked in conference rooms. They're not able to do their work, to engage in innovative opportunities, to take on new projects. And then, of course, the really bad meetings can contribute to employee strain. They can get stressed out. They can experience some negative consequences from going to some of these bad meetings. So these are just some meeting stats. Why do we care about meetings? We should care because this is a huge cost for companies in the United States and all over the world. And all of these stats that I'm giving you are pre-pandemic. So we do not have as much research in the past year about how many meetings are occurring, but given some anecdotal evidence, many people have experienced an uptick in meetings. Obviously, the format has changed. Many people are now meeting via Zoom, but I would not be surprised if these numbers are elevated, if anything. And I want to issue a little bit of a blind spot alert to people. So there's a lot of research on workplace meetings, and that's what I'm going to be covering today. We know a lot about meetings from scientific research. There is a whole field of study on workplace meetings, which might be shocking to some of you, but I have spent some of my career researching workplace meetings. I have worked with some of the leading scholars who spend a large portion of their careers just looking at meetings that happen at workplaces. One thing that we know from all of this research, and the research shows this loud and clear, is that we are probably poor judges of our own leadership skills when it comes to meetings. What often happens in workplace meetings is that the leader or the person who's organizing the meeting thinks that the meeting is going great, think that the meeting was great. But meeting attendees are the ones who often feel that the meeting stinks. So we have research that shows that the meeting leader consistently rates their meetings more favorably than the people who went to those meetings. So what's going on with that? I mean, everyone's in the same meeting. Shouldn't they have the same perspective on what's going on? Shouldn't they at least kind of be on the same page that, yeah, this was a horrible waste of time, or no, it went pretty well? Well, there's a couple reasons, again, from research why we think this might happen. So first, there's a natural human bias in how we perceive ourselves. People tend to think of themselves above average in general, when statistically, we know that can't be the case. Everyone can't be above average. There's some average for a reason. There's some people on the high end, some people on the low end. And this occurs in lots of different areas, not just meetings. So if we're asking people to rate their job performance or their driving ability or even their personal traits, people tend to see themselves and rate themselves as better than average. But with meetings in particular, the research suggests that this blind spot that leaders have might have to do with the amount of time that's spent talking in the meeting. So studies have shown that the people who talk the most in the meetings tend to think that the meeting went well. And who does most of the talking? The leader or the organizer of the meeting. So step one in fixing a problem is knowing that you have a problem. And many people who run meetings might not even know that there is a problem at all. Why do meetings stink? There are tons of reasons, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on 5. The meeting is too big. The meeting is too long. The meeting lacks engagement. So engagement means participation and how into it the participants are. Are they just sitting back on their phones, not paying attention? Or are they contributing to the discussion? Are they participating? So that's what engagement means. Another reason some meetings aren't so great is because of a bad agenda. And then we're going to talk about when meetings end poorly. So let's look at number one. Some meetings are too big. It is really easy to over-invite people to meetings. A lot of meeting scheduling is done digitally. So we just send that Outlook invitation, or we just send that Zoom link to everyone who might maybe have a connection to the meeting topic, which makes sense. You don't want to offend everyone. The more the merrier. We're looking for lots of opinions, right? Wrong. Think about the people who really need to be there and why they're being asked to attend. And I challenge those of you who are listening to keep meetings to just those employees who are essential only. Don't invite employees or colleagues who are non-essential to that meeting. You aren't doing them a favor, and you're not doing the meeting any favors. But I'm not saying that you need to have hidden, secretive meetings where people get offended that they're not invited. Don't hide the meeting. Share the meeting notes or the meeting minutes with people. Anything that was shared during the meeting, share those materials widely. And be open to questions from those people who didn't attend the meeting. We're not trying to hide it. We're just trying to be strategic about who we invite. And if you think some people might just come and sit there and not contribute, maybe they don't need to be there. If it's a virtual meeting, you can record it. So Zoom right now, this session is being recorded. You can actually send recordings of meetings to people. They may or may not watch it, but that's up to them. If they choose to watch it, they can even speed it up. They can listen to the audio at like 1.5 times or 2 times the speed. So you can actually participate, you can hear what happened in the meeting, but it's even more efficient, it's quicker than in real time. So you might be wondering, is there a magic number? How many people should I invite to the meeting? There is not really a magic number, but there kind of is. So if you can, try to keep your meetings to 8 participants or fewer, because we know when meeting size increases, so do the problems. You want to have active participants. Meetings are not a spectator sport for people to just sit there and multitask and do other things. And when you have more than 8 people, studies show it's a little bit harder to make sure everyone is actively participating. It's not impossible. It's not impossible. But if I were to come up with a magic number, I would say around 8. Also, and this is something that might be groundbreaking to many people, it is an option to invite certain people for only certain portions of the meeting. Now, this is something that is rarely done that I see in my experiences. And I think this is a function of how little we really plan our meetings in advance. If we don't know when we're going to discuss something or if we're even going to get to it, we just invite everyone for everything. So this takes much more planning in the beginning to figure out when you're actually going to cover certain portions and to make sure that the key individuals are in the room for those certain portions. But this can be very beneficial to make sure that you don't have people there unnecessarily. And you might be thinking, okay, well, then it's like a revolving door. We have folks coming and going. That's probably not great. It might actually not be a bad thing to have some of these natural pauses in the meeting, because this actually breaks things up a little bit, adds a little bit of variety. There's new people coming and going, and it lets the people who are still there maybe check their phone for a little bit, look at their email really quickly, attend to those things that might be distracting them so that they can actually stay focused during the meeting. So having these little breaks is not necessarily a bad thing, and I would challenge you to think of it in that way, that breaks are not a horrible thing. It's not a huge interruption to have people coming and going. I'm going to take a peek at the chat really quick, just to see. We have a question. If a supervisor asks, would anyone like to join this meeting? What's the best way to respond if you're interested, but it doesn't apply to your work? I'm going to take questions here and there, and then some other ones towards the end. I'm sorry, I think I cut someone off.
If you're not interested in the meeting.
Okay, if you're not interested in the meeting. Obviously, this is tricky. You know, thinking of it politically. I mean, you might not be willing to tell your boss, I think this is a waste of my time. I don't want to go. But I would encourage people to have these kinds of conversations in the most tactful way possible. But if you see that you've been invited to a meeting that you don't think is not applicable, I would follow up with that meeting organizer and ask them some questions. You don't have to come right out and say, I think that this is useless, but I would encourage you to send them an email and say, hey, I saw this meeting invite came in. I'm not quite sure how I could contribute. I'd like to prepare in advance. Do you know what I'll be asked to do or why I'm being asked to be there? So just probing a little bit, asking some questions as to why you're being asked to be there. I would encourage you to maybe use the preparation angle to say you want to prepare for the meeting. What tasks will I need to do related to this meeting? Is there anything that I could prepare? It might just be, oh no, I want you to be there just to get some information. And then of course, that's another conversation. Well, could I have the information without going to the meeting? But if this is something that consistently happens and it's your supervisor that's putting these meetings on your schedule, I would follow up with some questions before going to the meetings. And then if this happens a lot, I would have a conversation with them about your workload and how going to a few less meetings would actually help you accomplish the goals that you'd like to set. Did that help?
Yep, thank you.
Okay. It's tricky, but I'm putting a lot of this, responsibility on the meeting leaders. So if you are typically not a meeting leader, but you're a meeting attendee, this can be a little bit trickier to navigate. You can invite me to come do a talk in your department, and hopefully some of these themes will trickle down so your meeting leaders will get the hint. All right, the second reason why many meetings stink is that they're too long. So most meetings are about an hour long. This very presentation is scheduled for 1 hour today. There's nothing wrong with that, but it is a norm in the business community that we have 1 hour meetings. And if you think about it, meetings have different purposes, they have different scopes, they have different numbers of attendees, but most meetings are the same length. One explanation for why we think this happens is that it's just a norm. When Microsoft Outlook was developed, 60-minute scheduling appointments were the default. So that helped to reinforce this norm. For me, when I go in Outlook, the default is now a 30-minute meeting. I'm sure that can be changed depending on your organization, but back in the day, it was a 60-minute meeting. So this, I think, helped reinforce the norm, and then it kind of becomes a vicious cycle that when you have a meeting, it's an hour long. We also have some research to show that basically meetings will expand to whatever time you allot to them. So if you think of a meeting kind of like spray foam insulation, there's a hole in that schedule and the meeting will grow to fill that hole. You created that hole, and even if something could be accomplished in 30 minutes, but it's scheduled for a 60-minute meeting, many of the people are probably going to meet for 60 minutes. I keep doing this to emphasize how meetings grow and grow and grow. We allot the time, and then the meeting expands to fit the time. But when you stop and think about it, The meeting should fit the task at hand, right? By fitting the meeting to the task, hopefully you can trim back the meeting and regain some time on people's calendars. So I'm encouraging meeting leaders to do just that. Take time to think before you schedule the meeting. How many people are attending? Maybe more importantly, who are the people that are attending? Do you have some long-winded folks? Is this a really passionate issue for some people? What are the goals of the meeting? Are you expecting a lot of heated discussion or mostly just updates? How have your meetings gone in the past? Do you always schedule them for 30 minutes and then they go an hour? Or do you schedule them for an hour and it seems like you're pretty much done after 40 minutes and then everyone just kind of hangs out for the other 20 minutes? Don't be afraid to look at the task and schedule a meeting that is 28 minutes long, or 40 minutes, or 52 minutes. If that's the right fit, go with it. And it might even kind of pique some people's attention and make them a little curious. Like, what is up with this 28-minute meeting? That's the most random time I've ever seen. But it might make them a little bit curious. It might pique their interest. It will show, too, that there is some intention behind your decision. You're not just relying on the default calendar option. You're actually looking at what you're supposed to do and trying to fit the meeting for that time. There are, if you want to take it a bit further, there are even some best practices that suggest that you create the time estimate and then shave 5 to 10 minutes off of it. Wow, right? What that does is dial up the time pressure a bit to get people moving. We obviously don't want to cram an hour's worth of meeting stuff into 20 minutes because then that's going to backfire. But if you think an hour is a reasonable time for what you want to accomplish in the meeting, try scheduling it for 50 minutes to motivate you and everyone else to keep things moving. If it goes a little bit longer, if it goes to the hour mark, oh well. Try to avoid that. Try to keep it in the time that you schedule. But if you do give everyone back that 10 minutes, even if it's just 10 minutes to take a deep breath, use the restroom, get something to eat, refocus before their next meeting or their next task, that is 10 minutes that are being used well instead of just expanding because it can. Number 3, lack of engagement. I will also call this social loafing. So this is a term from psychological research. Social loafing is when people get lost in the crowd. There's enough people there that they don't really have to pay attention. They don't really have to participate because they're just sort of a face in the crowd. They could do other stuff. It's called social loafing. There's another issue that can happen in meetings, and it's not conscious disengagement, but maybe there's too many competing voices and opinions, and people feel like they can't engage because it's only like 2 or 3 people that are fighting with each other. They're just watching and they're not participating because they feel like they can't get a word in. So this is where the meeting leader should serve more as a meeting moderator and a facilitator of the discussions that are happening. So if you are leading a meeting and you see that someone's talking too much, address it. Ask for other people's opinions directly. Maybe tell the person that seems to be monopolizing everyone's time that you can schedule a meeting with them one-on-one to talk about things individually after the meeting. Maybe people, let's say, are engaged in the social loafing. They're on their phones, they're on their laptops. Maybe it's a video meeting and you have a bunch of people that don't have their camera on, they're not really participating in any way. There are 3 different things that I think you could do in this situation. The first would be to establish some ground rules. So before the meeting even happens, if you send out a reminder in advance or you send out an agenda, send a message regarding some ground rules, that you're not going to have your phones out, that we're not going to be multitasking, that we're going to have our cameras on. Give people some advance notice for that, because if you've been meeting for 9 months and everyone has their cameras off and you just start a meeting and say, okay, everyone turn your cameras off, who knows who's going to be in their pajamas or what they're doing. You want to give them some notice for this, and it should be intentional. You don't want to just do this as a power move, but because you really want to encourage face-to-face interactions, explain this to the people in the meetings, why you want this to happen. If you think people are disengaged in your meeting, the college professor in me has another suggestion. You can actively call on people to participate. But you can't do this if you have over-invited people to the meeting. So my tips work together. If you have too many people in the meeting, people who shouldn't even be there, who really aren't contributing to this conversation, you lose the power as the meeting leader to just start calling on people. Because chances are there are people in that room or in that Zoom meeting that shouldn't even be there to begin with. So you don't then just get to be calling on people willy-nilly saying that you want to hear their input on this issue. But if you make sure that the people who are in the meeting are the people who really need to be there, then it is okay to actively solicit opinions and not just say, does anyone have any feedback on this? My third tip for dealing with social loafing would be to switch things up in any way that is possible. Many of us have a lot of constraints on how we're meeting these days, but maybe if you could have the meeting in a different venue. So if you are meeting face-to-face, if you could have that in a different room or outside. Outside right now is a great way to meet for a lot of different reasons. Have a walking meeting, have a meeting in a different venue. Maybe if you can't do that, even just switch it up. If you have a meeting in the morning, typically have it in the afternoon. Try to do whatever you can to add a little variety to your meetings. The fourth reason why meetings might stink has to do with the agenda. If you even have an agenda, which many meetings don't even have one, and that's a whole nother issue. But often the agenda is organized just as a loose set of topics to be covered, maybe with no prioritization of what needs to be discussed first, and without any reflection on how long it's actually going to take to cover the items on the agenda. And research shows that there is a disproportionate amount of time that is spent on the items at the beginning of a meeting's agenda, regardless of what those things are. So they've actually done experiments where they've taken the same topics and rearranged them on meeting agendas. And the things that are earlier on the agenda have a disproportionate amount of time spent on them. So simply having an agenda is not enough. There's a lot of work on meetings that say you should have an agenda. Just having one is good, but there's still a lot more that you can do with an agenda. You actually have to put some thought into ordering the items on the agenda and how long each topic might take. And then not only thinking about what topics you need to be covering, but what's the process you're going to use to cover these topics? Will there be visuals? Are you going to ask people to discuss this in small groups? What does this actually look like in the meeting? So just putting a bunch of stuff, this is what we need to talk about in no particular order without thought of how the conversations are going to go is really not helping you all that much. The last reason why meetings might stink, before I go look at some of the questions, is that meetings often end badly. So too often meetings end because someone else needs the conference room or because some of the attendees need to leave because they have another meeting or some other commitment. This is often why meetings end. And that's the finale. Okay, I gotta go, and the meeting's over. You spend an hour together, maybe longer, and then poof, people just start disappearing without any sense of closure or clear directions. So as a meeting leader, or even as a meeting attendee, try to spend those last few minutes summarizing what are the key takeaways from this meeting. And then for each takeaway, designate a person who's responsible for that action item. I have some additional materials on how to lead a better meeting. I'm going to look at the questions now for a little bit of a break, see what we have going on. So if Sheila or Rachel or Jason have been looking at the questions, if there's any that stick out to you.
So Dr. Jane, Andreas has a really good question about how to organize the agenda to acknowledge that different people process things differently. So do you suggest that people prioritize? You mentioned about how at the things at the end of the meeting are shorter and things at the beginning are. So would you suggest that the more important things go first on the agenda? But Andreas's question is more about balancing the way people learn and think and process. And so just like a classroom piece says, with different learning styles. So how do you manage that challenge when you're creating a well-constructed agenda?
Yeah, so I think there's two different aspects at play here. When you're ordering the agenda, I would definitely look at what are your priority items. What is the reason that you're having this meeting? What is the most important things that need to be discussed? Oftentimes I see people, they kind of put things that they want to get out of the way early, like, okay, we just need to cover these little things and then we'll get to the real meat of the issue. But like I said, we know from research that people spend a disproportionate amount of time in the stuff in the beginning. So I would actually, if you have stuff that's not that important, I would actually recommend putting that at the end. Not because then you don't have to cover it. You should still be able to cover it in the time allotted. But I would prioritize the most important, what is the reason you're having the meeting, and make sure that that is up towards the front. Regarding the different learning styles, this is something that I think leaders would need to be very open to and try to solicit this feedback from the people who attend their meetings. So let's say a leader typically just hands out some written materials during the meeting and expects everyone to skim them and give their reactions right away. Obviously, that might not be best for some people. It would be better if those materials could be sent in advance. So I would hope that meeting leaders would solicit this feedback. We know that most people don't know that the meetings that they lead are not going so great. So in those instances, if you are a person who is in the meeting, who is often dealing with, things going too fast, or you want more time to look at materials, that I would suggest reaching out to the people who schedule those meetings, seeing if you could get anything in advance. I would also just recommend, as an educator, as someone that has taught different groups of people, different age ranges, different learning styles, that you try to mix it up as much as possible. So obviously, if things lend themselves to visuals, to provide those things. If you can offer information in a written form as well as discussing it, even if it's just some notes about what you're talking about in depth, that can be very beneficial to people. So trying to mix it up as much as possible in terms of learning styles, and then prioritizing your agenda regarding the most important things first. Does that answer your question?
Yes, the performer in me always thinks of working in a meeting kind of like you would work in a program where you're setting up a musical program, that you have to think about your audience and how you're constructing that and what is the goal that you want to achieve. So I would love to talk more, and maybe you have more insight why it is that you think that things at the front of the meeting address them more fully, because there's sometimes that people need a warm-up exercise, or like some things to get the juices flowing before they can tackle something big. So I would love to understand where that research is coming from and why it is that you're recommending putting the bulk of what you're trying to address. I mean,
So I was having trouble with my audio. I couldn't hear everything you said, but
oh, sorry.
no, it's okay. But it seems like with when leaders are scheduling meeting, the more information you can give people in advance, the better. So oftentimes if people get anything, they get an agenda, but that's it. And I'm going to talk on my next section about how to change the agenda. But I actually recommend that you frame your meeting, instead of just an agenda with topics to be discussed, you change it to questions that need to be answered. And I would encourage you to send those questions to people in advance. So just like you would send an agenda with topics and you would just, here's what we want to cover. Instead, framing your agenda as questions that need to be answered and sending those questions to people so that they can get those juices flowing, so that they can start thinking about things. Because we know, and like I said, this was a controlled experiment where they looked at the same topics, but they just rearranged them. And it seems like people are most invested, most willing to participate earlier in the meeting. And this could be a resource strain issue, that the longer they're applying their cognitive functions, the more they're interacting, the more tiring this can become. So when you first get into a meeting, to really try to hit the key topics first.
Jane, you have a couple questions that follow sort of a pattern about meaningless meetings. Meetings that you really don't know why you're there. They're updates. There's really no decision to be made. How do you frame it so it's not a waste of your time? And also, is there a good rule of thumb about not having a meeting, but updating people in another manner? For example, sharing a PowerPoint with them, or sending an email that kind of summarizes things, so they don't have to take an hour of their day. They can take 10 minutes and read your message or look at your PowerPoint.
Yeah. So if a meeting can be an email, I recommend that it is. So typically, just sharing updates does not necessitate a meeting. And many, many, many organizations, departments within organizations all over the place have update meetings. So if you can do it via another channel like email, I would recommend that you do. Another way to make these, we know from research, another way to make these types of update quick huddle meetings a little bit more efficient is to actually have them when people are standing up, and to schedule them for 15 minutes. So it really is a different kind of mindset. Like, we're all coming together, we're all giving an update, we're going to have a huddle, and it's a huddle like a sports team would stand near each other. Granted, we are in COVID times. This looks a little bit different given our current restrictions, but changing it up. If it truly is an update meeting, 15 minutes, definitely probably doesn't need to be an hour, probably doesn't need to be 30 minutes. And try to truly frame it as an update meeting. Have everyone stand up. It makes it go a lot quicker. It's shocking how just changing someone's physical, whether they're sitting or standing, can make a difference. But those types of huddles tend to work out really well for those. But again, I would challenge people to look at that differently. If it can be an email, it should be an email.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Another question about Jessica leads meetings that value collaborative decision making. So how do you find the balance between discussion and getting to a decision point? How do you keep moving people along the pathway from all their collaborative discussion to actually making a collaborative decision?
So I've seen some really cool studies that look at actually separating the discussion from the decision making. So oftentimes there is this pressure cooker kind of situation. We need to make a decision, so we're going to discuss this a lot, and then the discussion ends because we have to make a decision. So when possible, I know given deadlines and other things, this can be hard, but when possible, if you feel like that pressure cooker situation is not good for discussions and people aren't really given the opportunity to think through options, having purely a discussion meeting on the issues and then have a separate decision-making forum, whether or not that's having people vote or respond by email or another meeting. I know I'm trying to eliminate the amount of meetings, and now I'm just saying take one meeting and make it two, but it doesn't have to be twice as long. So potentially separating the discussion of the issues from the actual decision making. Another way you can do that is to solicit input on issues beforehand. So again, as the meeting leader, asking people for their opinions before the meeting, and then showing these opinions anonymized is totally fine, recommended, on a PowerPoint slide. Here are our options. These, I've asked people for options in advance. Here they are. Let's talk about each of these individually. So I've seen those strategies work well, just based off of research. And it can be tricky. It can be really tricky, but having the meeting leader sort of change their mindset into a meeting facilitator is really helpful with this. And how can I try to make the most out of the people's time together? So sometimes that means getting options before, sometimes that means separating the decision a little bit from the heat of the moment and the discussion.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to come back to questions in a little bit, but I want to finish with some additional strategies. Okay, we know why they stink. So now I'll spend some time on this slide. So I've given a lot of tips and tricks so far. Hopefully some of them are useful for you, but here are some additional points. The first one is to change your mindset. This is really for the people who are out there scheduling the meetings. Adopt the mentality that you are a steward of other people's time. You are asking people to take time away from their work. This is taking wages from the company. Do not waste this time. Treat employees like you would customers and do some planning before that meeting. Lots of times, if we're meeting with an important client, we're meeting with someone who we think is important, we will spend time planning before the meeting. But often we don't give this same courtesy to our colleagues or to our subordinates or to the people that we meet with frequently. So obviously realize that maybe you're not as good at leading meetings as you might think you are, and try to fix it. And some early, easy ways that you can do this is, first start trying to take the pulse of your meetings just by observing what's going on. Are people on their phones? Does everyone have their camera off? Are there side conversations? Does one person do most of the talking? Do you get through all of your agenda items, or do you get through like one thing out of 10 things? So this is a way that you can get some feedback on your meetings without anyone besides you even realizing that you are analyzing your own meetings, and you can try to start improving. After you've done a little bit of observation, I would ask people for feedback on the meetings that you organize. In some companies, this may sound really crazy. People might think you're nuts if you send them a follow-up email that said, hey, what went well in that meeting? What could I maybe improve? But this is really how you can get some feedback. If emails are not your thing, you can set up an anonymous survey. You can even pass out pieces of paper if you're meeting face-to-face and tell people they don't have to put their name on it, but what's going well, what can be improved, and look at those responses and try to do something. Anything can help. But then in the meeting themselves, the leaders also need to think of themselves as not just a steward, but as a facilitator. So when you see comments or discussions that you like, reinforce that by saying, I love that discussion. I really appreciate everyone's participation. Thank you. This signals to people what you're looking for without having to spell it out to people like, yes, I want you to talk. You can do it a little bit more casually. And as a facilitator, you can actively work to improve the process of the discussion. And this takes work. You have to try, see what works out with different groups of people, what's working out in your organization. But let's say if you want to push people toward a more in-depth conversation, you always have these meetings, no one talks, no one participates. You could appoint someone or a couple people to play the role of devil's advocate in the meeting. And you tell everyone else, hey, I told Sheila to be the devil's advocate. So when we're coming up with ideas, I told her to try to shoot some holes in this. It's important to tell everyone that you've done this so that everyone doesn't just think Sheila woke up one day and is in a horrible mood. But you can experiment with some of these different things to try to push discussion. The agenda itself, that's another way you can improve the meeting. I already hinted at this before, but instead of a list of topics, frame the agenda as a list of questions. So this can help in 3 different ways. The first, it helps you to understand who should attend the meeting. Who can help me answer these questions? Not just like who has a tangential connection to this topic. If you frame it as questions, you know clearly when the meeting's over, when you have answered those questions. And if you can't think of questions, then you probably don't need to have a meeting. So this is where the purely just update meetings might not be necessary. There's no question here. There's no reason to get people together. This approach might not work for all of your different types of meetings, but at the very least, when you're coming up with an agenda, ask people what should be on the agenda and don't just recycle it for every single meeting. Then the last thing I'm going to talk about is setting the tone. So leaders and meeting attendees can set the tone for the meeting. And one way that you can do that, especially if you're the leader, is to state the values of the meeting. So I think that meeting leaders should really emphasize why they're calling the meeting, giving people almost like a mission statement for this meeting and what their expectations are. So some examples of this could be, I really want to hear everyone's honest feedback. I expect everyone to be involved in this conversation. There's a reason that you're in this meeting because I want to hear from you. You can even set expectations regarding people keeping their comments succinct, including you, that this is an expectation that you have, that people will be succinct. Maybe even that people will keep their phones away or other kinds of technology things. So this sets the tone and starts the meeting on the right foot. But again, remember, if you have a meeting that's too long or you have a meeting that has too many people, it's going to be hard for you to set these values and expectations and getting buy-in from the people who are there. And the last thing I want to say about tone has to do with some of my own research on meetings. So as a meeting leader, your energy really matters. And there's something we know from research called emotional contagion. Just like we're all now really familiar with the concept of contagious disease, emotions can be contagious, positive and negative. So the people in the meeting, those emotions can spread. And as a meeting leader, you should try to have a positive mood. And I'm not saying that it needs to be all sunshine and rainbows and over the top and happy and bubbly, but starting a meeting with some level of energy, appreciation, and gratitude. Even in hard, stressful times, we can still show gratitude and show our appreciation for everyone coming together. I would also encourage meeting leaders to encourage participants to express their true feelings. And this is where I have done some research in the past. So I'm sure most of us can think of times when we did not express our true feelings in meetings. And my research in particular, suggests that employees do fake their emotions in workplace meetings. And when they do this, regardless of the topic of the meeting, how many people were there, how long it was, when they fake positive emotions in their meetings, they end up being less satisfied with that meeting and feel like the meeting was less psychologically safe. And psychological safety is just the idea that you feel safe to speak up and that you're willing to take risks. It feels like a safe space there. And we also found out that this is more common with employees lower in the organization's chain of command. And that's why this article is called Faking It for the Higher Ups, because we found out that when you're lower in the organization's hierarchy, that you tend to do this more, and that you experience those negative consequences even more, that you feel like the meetings are even less effective and that you feel less safe at work. So this is the research in particular that was covered in the Wall Street Journal, which was one of the coolest professional things that has ever happened to me.
And Jane also won Best Paper Award for that particular paper.
That is, yes, you can say that is an award-winning research paper. You are correct, yeah. So that's some of my research. I've done a lot of synthesizing what some other folks in the field have done. And one of the best resources that you can get is this book on the screen right now called The Surprising Science of Meetings. And it is by one of my colleagues and one of my mentors when I was in graduate school. His name's Stephen Rogelberg. He is the authority on meetings research. And he wrote this awesome book. It was named one of the top #1 management books of 2019. And he is the authority on this field. So if you are looking for other resources, his book is where you need to go. We have a couple minutes left. What questions can I answer?
So there's a couple really good questions, Jane. First of all, I, like most of the people on the call today, are amazed that people are experts in meetings. So we all attend a lot of meetings, but to think that somebody actually makes their career around research on meetings is just like that. Just, I need to read that book so I can find out all the secrets. We had a lot of people make some comments, some really good guidelines, especially around Donna talking about the agenda in question format. That really resonated with her. Eric is asking about people who come late to meetings. Do you wait and give them more time, or do you respect the time for people who came? And then what do you do when somebody waltzes in late? Like how best to handle that? Obviously, we don't want to shame people, but you do want to share some expectations. Any tips on how to handle that?
Yeah, I've seen this differently depending on the organization or the company. Some companies, and this is also a cultural thing too, beyond company culture, but like national origin culture, that some people are late all the time, and that's just the norm. So my advice is to act like a steward of other people's time. I said that. So of course I would recommend starting the meeting on time. But if you recognize that everyone always comes to these meetings late, this is a norm, I would set those expectations in advance, that one of my expectations for the meeting is that we are going to start on time because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. It's really adopting that stewardship mindset that you are not wasting people's time. So having people sit there waiting for someone else, I think, is a huge, huge, huge waste of time. But again, you have to be sensitive to this. If you have always started meetings 15 minutes late, you can't just come in one day and drop the hammer, and people are confused as to why they missed the first 15 minutes of the meeting. But I would make the expectations clear that meetings are going to start when they start, and you're going to do your best to make sure that the meeting's not too long, not too short, Goldilocks here, just right. So you want people to be there when you schedule it. If someone does come in late, I would encourage them to, engage with the resources afterwards. So if someone is taking notes, someone's taking minutes, you have visuals, you have materials, give it to them afterwards. But I would not recommend holding up everyone's time for those who are late to the meeting.
Thank you. Dawn, thank you for giving us the Amazon link to the book. So if anyone is interested in the book or finding out more about it, there's a link in the chat for the book that Dr. Jane is recommending. We have a couple questions about public comment and how public comment can often divert a meeting. So I presume they're talking about public meetings, but it also could be applied to comment, how sometimes people go down rabbit holes at meetings and everyone around the table is kind of grinning and bearing it, but it really is a waste of time. So could you talk a little bit about how, when you talk about stewardship, I think that's a really good tip. But as we come into the end of our time together, perhaps you could just summarize some tips on that.
Yeah, so again, I think a lot of this is on the meeting leader to guide conversations. So meeting leaders don't just put it on everyone's calendar and come up with this loose set of topics and then sit back and watch it all unfold. The meeting leader should, part of that stewardship mindset involves being a facilitator. So you might need to try to encourage participation from some people while discouraging participation from other people. And that's not in an effort to make that person be quiet or make them go away, but it's really to honor the fact that you have people together for a reason. If you wanted just one person to talk, they could do that at home looking in the mirror by themselves. So a meeting is called for a reason, and there are benefits to having people discuss and go through ideas in a more collaborative fashion instead of just one person talking. So I would put this on the meeting facilitator to really try to, you don't have to tell the person to be quiet, but who else can I hear from? Does anyone else have insights onto this? Summarizing, constantly trying to put a bow on what the person is saying. So if they're talking, okay, I think what you're saying is this, is that correct? Okay, does anyone have any feedback on that? And moving on. If you're a meeting participant and you feel as if you are just the victim to someone else taking over your meeting, hijacking the meeting, I would encourage you to speak up, let your opinions be known, because it's really easy for one person to dominate when everyone else does sit back. So encouraging active participation from everyone, even if the meeting leader doesn't realize what's going on, trying to regain a little bit control from the attendees.
Jane, can I just ask one question on that comment? So if some comments wind up being really out in left field and off the focus of the purpose of the meeting, is that when you would invoke the parking lot? How might a leader bring that piece in?
Yeah, so Rachel's talking about this idea that you have a parking lot. It's kind of an area over here where we can put that for later. And I like the parking lot idea. A lot of times, you hear leaders say like, okay, let's put a pin in that and we'll come back to that later. Because again, if you have a clear focus on the purpose of the meeting, what you want to accomplish, why those specific people are there, it becomes a little clearer when something doesn't belong. If you don't have that clarity to begin with, it can just go into all kinds of crazy directions. But I like the idea of the parking lot, or actively creating a list of things that were brought up that were great, but they don't belong here. This is not the purpose of this meeting. But again, you can't navigate that as well if you don't have a clear purpose and that purpose isn't shared with everyone in advance. So I would be really clear as to what the purpose of the meeting is, so that it's easier to spot those things and say, yes, we do need to discuss that, and we will do X, Y, and Z to address that. But right now we're talking about this.
Thank you. That's a really important thing, taking things offline. Sometimes there are things that come up that are really to be discussed between two individuals, and rather than the entire group, and to be able to put that to the side and say, we're going to pay attention to that, but not, we'll take it offline, we'll do it later, or we'll do a one-on-one. So I think that's really helpful. Thank you, Jane. We have used our time. Talk about an hour that went fast. We're talking about like trying to compress things. Don't compress this one, because every time I hear this, I learn new things. So thank you very much, Jane, and everyone for joining us. I hope this has been helpful. It sounds like from, someone said this was an effective meeting. So Jane, you are a good steward of our time together. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks so much. Bye now. Great to see everyone.